Okay, and we are live. Hello, everyone. This is episode. I just read the thumbnail, but I think it's episode 12. So yeah, so things are picking up, and as you can see, also really cool guest so far, and today is not an exception either. So we have James G. Elmslie, which yeah, a lot of you should know or do know, but I'll let actually James introduce himself, and he'll probably do a better job than I can. So, hi,
I'm not sure
James.
about that. Well, hello there. As has been said, my name's James Elmslie. I am partly a craftsman, partly a researcher. These days, I'm not sure which I put first. Maybe I'm a researcher who also makes crafts. I have been working as a craftsman for about 18 years now. And I've been doing research on the subject of medieval and early Renaissance single-edged arms for about 15 years now, specializing in the study of the objects, trying to understand a subject which isn't very heavily published. Especially back when I started, it was very much a case there was just half a dozen pages as a footnote in books where everybody thought that the European sword was almost universally two-edged. So I've been slowly working over this time to produce some sort of publication on that, which may end up being published before the heat death of the universe, or may end up as a posthumous publication, in which case it's not my problem any longer.
You do have about 5 billion years before the heat death, so.
Well, cross fingers, I might get it.
Well, oh yeah, or a few years, yeah.
So yes, that's roughly what I sort of get up to. I would thoroughly recommend people in the channel say hello and drop any questions in, because I thoroughly intend to cause as much trouble as possible with controversial views or just weird random shit that I can come up with. So feel free to drop questions in. I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well as the general stream, so I'll hopefully make this as interactive as possible.
Very cool. So yeah, this isn't really something I normally we don't need to be careful in the chat, even given the topic. It's not super controversial, but so feel extra free, everyone, to bring your controversial challenges to the chat. Okay, so already out of the first things you mentioned, okay, you're not sure exactly where you fall now between research and craftsmanship, but have you gone in phases in the course of these, let's say, 15 to 18 years, and what has been the priority throughout time? And
oh yeah, well, I eventually originally started off just as a craftsman. I started doing HEMA way back in the dark ages, before Matt Easton had even coined the term HEMA, in fact. I was living in Edinburgh, which is a hive of martial arts lunatics of various different groups. The legendary one being the Dawn Duelist Society, which at the time was jokingly referred to as a drinking club with a sword problem. It's become a little bit more respectable since then, but I was on the periphery of that group with a society called Lafine Experimental Archaeology, who we all met in the same pub, which says it all, really. But at the time, there really wasn't anything in the way of proper HEMA martial arts equipment. People were still using lacrosse gloves and getting broken fingers every week and things like that. And all the swords were just ugly. The phrase I like to use is they fell out the ugly tree and hit every branch on the way down. And in the peak of Dunning-Kruger, I looked at these and I looked at what I had done and I went, I did bronze casting in art college. I can make that. And so I did, because I didn't know any better. Um, so the net result was somebody else then goes, ooh, could you make me one? And then somebody goes, ooh, could you make me one? And the next thing you know, I was making more and more and more. And I ended up going professional as a result. Spent a couple of years making reenactment and HEMA pieces, and then at some point I realized that I was spending so much effort and time making blunts that I would do exactly the same thing for making sharps, which obviously cost quite a bit more to sell. So it was a bit of a no-brainer to start going for more and more accurate. And at that point, you start diving into research, studying the objects, and it goes from just looking at a picture in, say, Oakshot, which was the main publication at the time, and you start traveling to museums, and then you start handling things in museums, and then you start publishing things which are in the museums, and it keeps on going from there, really.
So, well, the questions actually keep adding up, so I'll try and keep track of them mentally. When you focus on reproducing antiques, in a sense, I think every smith seems to have their own idea of what that means. So whether it's style, whether it's the metallurgy, whether it's the balance and the aspect, I guess it's a mix of everything for most good smiths. Which ones are the characteristics that you focus on most in terms of reproducing historicity?
I tend to go with modern metallurgy and occasionally with modern production processes. So I quite often use more stock removal than a medieval smith who would forge. I have a huge amount of respect for people like Gail Fabre, for instance, with his absolutely amazing hammer control. He forges pieces to, within a fraction of a millimeter of where it would be, and very little grinding. I've had problems with ligament and connective tissues for years now, and it's becoming more of a problem. So I don't do as much forging as I would like, simply because it's too physically damaging for me. So I very much aim to have the piece where the finished piece looks exactly like the original, even if the methods of production aren't the same. And the more I work on things, the more I try to find how the methods of production are, because that does shape how the original pieces are. A good example of that is if you look at fullers in a blade, most of them are just a round cross section, so you can stick it on a grinder and grind that away. But you do get some which are very much almost a square section, and that will not be cut on a grinding wheel. So you have to learn to use hand tools to scrape away to get the actual shape. And so I've ended up studying those processes, and I'll try and find shortcuts which limit the damage it does to my body. But sometimes you just have to damage your body to do it right. And that's very much my point of view, is if it's worth doing right.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. And have you found any unique challenges when trying to apply modern processes to reproduce antique effects that are unique of the modern process?
There's all sorts of little details, and the closer you look into the detail, the more you spot the problems. One of the areas I find quite fascinating is nowadays we use modern electric grinders, and it's a substitute for a water wheel with a stone wheel on it. Now, you don't want a stone wheel which is spinning at 3,000 RPM. It will kill you. If it cracks, it's going to be like a a bomb going off. So
Mm-hmm.
we use a belt which has much more consistent, even abrasive. It's we can set what grit we're using, but it also is turning much faster, and that completely changes how the process of grinding is done. So one of the things I've been trying is learning to work with a very slow speed with a lot of water cooling, and you get a very relaxed motion. It's how shall I describe it? It's like the difference between sort of high speed power and sort of low, um, almost gradual work. It doesn't heat up as much. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
cut in the same sort of ways, and that changes how the person would work. And a grinding wheel for this sort of for a mid, let's say, 15th century is going to be, at least
Yeah.
a meter in diameter.
Yeah.
So it's moving very, very slowly, but it's not a flat surface, and that changes how you're working on it.
Mm-hmm.
I was very fortunate a few years back to study a couple of the pieces from the Castellan hoard. And there's one single edge sword in that, which is a bit of an anomaly. It's very low class munitions grade. And you can actually see the grinding marks still in the steel, even though it was underwater for 500 odd years. It's quite a coarse finish. And you would expect, if you're holding a blade, on a wheel, you would do this, but you don't. If you look at this, it's been done at an angle. So
Mm-hmm.
whoever's been doing it has been working that in a very different way to a modern machine works. And understanding how that process was done, I think, is quite important, because it teaches us the methods of the craftsmen in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Robert McPherson is an armorer in the United States. He's incredibly talented, and he's had a signature which is used in the armor archives, and it's very profound. It's made me think quite a lot, which was the crafts or the masters of old kept their secrets, and neither us nor they are richer for it. The idea
Mm-hmm.
that these secrets and these methods have been lost is a disservice to them. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what fascinates me for craft, is to understand the processes that they used, even if I'm using modern equivalents in what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And trying to capture that, I think, is quite important. It's what I tend to call heritage craft.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck a few years ago. I was reading a record of King James the Fourth of Scotland, and it had the name of the cutler who had um, done the restoration work for what was supposedly the sword of William Wallace, but also had made daggers for the royal court.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me realize that I am part of a heritage which goes back in this country for 500 years, a heritage which goes back in Europe for more than 1,000 years. And I think it's important that any craftsman not only honors the past, but also does their best to pay that forward to a future generation, whether that's teaching or whether it's recording our understandings. And you just need to look at, what the swords were like in the 1970s, where a lot of the living skills had been lost after World War II. And there
Mm-hmm.
was sort of a new generation had to come in, and they were so incredibly crude and basic in many ways. And I think the internet has given us a golden age of sharing and understanding and knowledge, which has
Yeah.
enabled people to really step up the quality of work to a standard that hasn't really sort of been there since probably the golden age of Wilkinson and the likes in the end of the 19th
Mm.
century. So I think I have a personal responsibility to do that.
I think that is a very cool approach, actually. And I think it's one that probably shared across different disciplines as well, because I
Yes.
see that a lot of the uh, there used to be, I think, an approach that was more simplistic to
Yeah.
craftsmen in the past. It was like, oh, that's cool and antique, but like a kind of evolutionary uh, view of things. Whereas a lot of stuff we lost in terms of techniques or ways of doing things, and it seems like
Yes.
people are now interested in gathering it again. So that's super cool. In the meantime, we have a few questions, a couple on the controversial side. So, one, when do you release your book? From Julian Ronenberger. So, but I think you addressed that within the end of the universe, I think,
Yes.
is the
Maybe.
deadline. We have a justice for single-edged swords. I think we can all agree with Simon.
Yeah.
Damocles was asking if I think the sword you were talking about with the grind marks
Yes.
is the one from the first series of Windlass.
Yeah. That's
Um,
exactly the one. The windlass sword is better made than the real one.
hmm.
The original, I really want to make one someday, and I know that it's going to get absolutely panned because if I want to make it accurate to the real one, it's going to be so bad. You know, it's going to have grind marks all over it. I probably won't even polish the pommel and the hilt. I'll use a file and hand file it to get to the finish. Um, you know, it's going to be absolute rubbish, but it will be
But
exact to the real one. And I quite like that because I think it's important to challenge people's preconceptions of perfect machine-made straight lines and all of that. And the real one is brilliant. You know, it's got a cross with these two droopy bits, except one droops more than the other, and the pommel is squint, and it's great. And I think that sort of handmadeness of it is something which is quite important. I quite like reflecting on that sort of nature of it being handmade.
mhm.
There's a beautiful sword in Glasgow Museum's Scottish two-hander, and I was looking at it, and I could see the file marks, and I was sitting there with it on the table, going, "Ah, they did this," you know, and understanding that there was a craftsman 500 years ago who was doing exactly that same motion.
Mhm.
Understanding what they did, I think, something which, again, the heritage crafts subject. So yes,
Yeah.
getting distracted
And
already.
before we go on with that, I've been talking about William Wallace's sword. It was the big two-hander, right?
Right. Oh, where do we start? Yeah. Probably not, but maybe, but not the ones which you expect from William Wallace. Um, I had some frustrating times a year or two ago. I was trying to get access to the Wallace sword in Stirling. It's not the only Wallace sword, by the way. Most people won't know, but there is actually a second one, which is in the private collection of one of the descendants of the Earl de Moray, who were
Hmm.
the other here guardians of Scotland from that period. Unfortunately, it's also a 15th century sword. Um, but we eventually managed to get to the point where I was able to arrange access to the sword, but only if we paid enough to close the entire Wallace monument for a day. And the Wallace monument makes sort of like 10, 15,000 pounds per day. And it's just like, yeah, can't really afford this, can we? Which is really a little bit frustrating. Because I would love to do a study of that one and disassemble it forensically. We definitely had a lot of interesting studies of that, however, and the history of that piece it's more an illustration of a desire to link an object to a hero than it is a piece of archaeology. And I think it's a great sort of warning sign for people of any sort of group to really sort of see if that makes a difference to them. They don't listen.
I'll just, sorry, quickly interrupt you to test my volume because Damocles is letting me know that my volume was a little high. So I think I fixed it. Let me know if it's off or on, and then we can keep going. Sorry. Speaking of Wallace swords, I actually had a question. The blades are usually like, is the whole sword usually 15th century in both cases, you think, or can we think that part of it at least may be a little like the Cid sword that has an older blade?
The blade is actually 3 different swords which have been welded together.
Okay.
Now the problem is, for simplicity, you've got the tip, the middle, and the forte, the strong. If the strong is 13th century, the chances are he would have had a single-handed sword. So the tang is too long, but we can't look inside it to find out if there's another piece welded on. The middle piece might be, but if it is, it's very unusual. And the tip isn't, because it doesn't have a fuller or anything like that. So it's possible, but it's very unlikely. And this, one of the things which we know is the records which I mentioned have a record of the hilt and what they call the plummet, the pommel, being replaced. But that was around 1505. And the style of the crossguard and pommel on the Wallace guard are not from 1505. They're from about 1560, maybe, give or take 10, 15 years. So it raises the question, was the Wallace sword taken, re-hilted, returned to Dumbarton Castle, and then somebody switched them for a different sword, either intentionally or accidentally? You know, somebody might have sort of said, oh yes, there's a sword of William Wallace. Which one is it? It's that one. And pointed at the wrong one. And that's become part of history. In which case, the real Wallace sword might well have been thrown away.
That would be sad, but not a rare occurrence.
Yeah, we know that there is an inventory of the castle from about 1600, which sort of describes, I think it's something like 40 or 20 old swords, rusted and useless.
Ouch.
Yeah. So it might have been one of the other 20, and who knows where it's gone.
Hopefully not. Yeah. When you talk about welds or different parts of swords, as a sword maker and someone who has experience with antiques, is there something that to tell you whether a repair job was done in the time for extending the life of the object versus just as a, okay, we'll kind of fix it up and display it?
It's difficult to tell. Doing a forge weld, usually on swords, what you find is what's called either a scarf or a lap weld, where you take the two pieces and you put them on top of each other so they overlap a little bit. You don't just sort of butt them on like that. It's then heated up red hot or past red hot and crushed together, and it'll weld the pieces. But that creates a lot of oxides, which kind of hides the corrosion and blends into it. So unless it was done very recently, it's quite difficult to really tell. And obviously, heating it like that will destroy the heat treatment of the blade. So you can't really look at it on a metallurgical scale to sort of go, oh yes, this bit's hard and this bit's soft. It's going to be like that, whatever. So it's very much a case of having to sort of try and work out what the context is of how it was found and things like that. There's a fascinating one in Glasgow museums, which is a Langus Messer with probably about the last sort of 6 inches or so, which have been welded back on. And I think it was a working life repair, but it could so easily be a relatively modern adjustment as well. X-rays make it a lot easier. There's an infamous example now of a very wide Oakshott Type 13, where Oakshott made a mistake and wrote the length of it as being about 81 centimeters, and the real one is about 65. So somebody, no names named. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. It's about fakes already.
We've gone on. Yeah, perfectly okay.
15 centimeters has been grafted onto that blade, and you can't actually tell that it's been grafted on. It's been very, very well done, unless you look at X-rays, at which point it becomes clear that there's a difference between these two parts. And that's part of the difficulty, is spotting which ones are intentional, artificial fakes, which ones are slightly more honest repairs, and which ones are contemporary working life repairs. It's very, very difficult to be able to tell them apart just from the eye, and especially from photographs. It's a real nightmare to try and get hold of that sort of information.
And as a practitioner, would you think the repairs would have made sense in the time? Like, would they have held up, let's say, more than just one more bout? Or
I think it's just one more bout or just one more battle before we go back home type sort of affair. I think people underestimate how fragile sword blades were. If you've got a HEMA sword, it's got a 3 millimeter edge. You can smack it against your friends for years and it'll end up getting burred and the likes. But you switch that to a sharp, you go into a bind, you twist around, and those pieces will tear out of your blade, and you'll end up with almost like flukes of shark fin or something like that. And you can't put that back in a scabbard. It will tear the scabbard up. You can grind it out, but you can only grind it out so many times before you've not got any meat left on your sword. And I think that people underestimate just how fragile and how disposable sword blades were. The sheer scale of industry, centers like Solingen and Passau would be, producing them by the gross, 144 in a barrel being shipped down at a time. Workshops are probably producing a gross a day. So, if you imagine that's 500 sword blades in a week, it's a huge number which is coming out just from one workshop. Armor is the same. I often talk
That was
about.
about to be my next question.
Yes.
So,
Well, there's an
perfect.
amazing example from Italy, from the Milanese armorers, where
Mhm.
I believe it was an instance where the Venetians were defeated in battle and had their entire heavy cavalry captured. And they eventually negotiated the release, but they were released without their armors and weapons. So the army was functionally useless. So an order was sent out to the armorers of Milan to re-equip the army. And there are records of this, and the numbers I'm going to give are just off the top of my head, but it's approximately something like 5,000 harnesses of armor and sets of gauntlets and helmets, several thousand other pieces of shields and the likes were delivered in 6 weeks.
Yeah,
5,000
there.
harnesses in 6 weeks. That's the sheer scale of the industry that was going
Yeah,
on there. And that was considered normal.
yeah. There's. I think you can find in the chat I had with Giovanni Sartori. He was showing like the images of like these proto-industrial setups where you had. And this is in the Belluno area, so not even Milan. I mean, still a big center, but of course you have
Yes.
Belluno, Milan, Brescia, all just in the area of northern Italy. Plus you have Germany, plus you have Spain. The
Italy.
amount of material would have been astounding, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
The Misaglias are an amazing example of this, in
yes,
that
yes,
they started off as a family of craftsmen. They became successful. They didn't just own the factory or the workshops. They bought barges so that they could ship the raw iron ore from the mines in the mountains. They bought the mines. Then they bought the forests next to the mines
yeah.
so that they could do charcoal production, so that they could ensure that they had the steel. Then they bought the ships and experts to go to each of the different courts around Europe so that they could have custom fitting. And at the end of all of that, they still had so much money that they ended up buying a barony.
Yeah, and they were gifted the mill too. At least
Yes.
one of their mills was gifted. But so, yeah, that's crazy. And actually, their house was in the center of Milan, and it was called the House of Hell in Italian, if I'm not mistaken. That's probably because of the like noise
Yeah.
and sadly, as with many lost things, I was reading it was demolished, I think in the early 20th century. So it lasted all the way and it still had like their coat of arms or their
Yeah.
maker's mark essentially on the walls. And so, yeah, another sad story, but
Tragedy of the 20th
crazy.
century.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, so we actually had one more comment just before I lose it. Phil Simondi, I think going back, closing a few tangents, he's still agreeing with your point about modern replicas, yeah, not being, well, or actually proper replicas looking potentially bad to the modern eye. And then we have a very
Hello, David.
compliments, I guess, from so thank you, David. And we still haven't even started talking about single-edged medieval weapons. So perhaps
Oh dear.
we can
Yeah,
actually.
half an hour, and I've only started on how many tangents so far? Um,
Oh, not enough for me at least, but
yeah.
but maybe we can start. I actually have a question then. Why single-edged weapons, especially considering they were so poorly documented, and I assume it was a bit of a effort to start researching.
Oh yeah. I mean, why did I start researching them?
Yes,
Or
why that
okay.
rather than
Uh,
the.
well, there's a bad story. Um, And it also reflects very badly on me. I am a nerd. There's no way of denying that. And I must admit that I quite enjoy a war game called BattleTech. Way back in the early days of the internet and all that, there weren't really very many good forums for that. So I used to occasionally frequent 4chan's traditional games board. And 4chan also did arms and armor threads. And one of these, I used to sort of browse them because you'd get random pictures of, swords and things like that, which you hadn't really intended to look for. And it was good for getting inspiration and ideas. And somebody posted up a picture of the Conyers falchion in one of these threads. And I'd been looking at it, a little bit of the published information at the time. And they were talking about it being a heavy axe-like cleaver and all of this sort of stuff. And so I just sort of chimed in, which I didn't normally do on these sort of threads. And I said, I don't think you're right there. It's I've been looking at this. It's only about 1.6 millimeters thick. It's really, really thin. It's not heavy. Oh, you're an idiot, you're wrong, and all of these sorts of insults start flying, as you can imagine, on a cesspit of the internet like 4chan. And so me being a contrary type, looked at it and went, you know what? I'm going to do a web page about these. I've never made a web page. But yeah, it just sort of set me off. I fell down the rabbit hole from this point because at the time there was sort of like 2 or 3 little web pages about them. The main one was Foxtail Bjorn, whose surname I always forget, I apologize, who had a page about the Conyers and the Thorpe. And there were probably only about 3 or 4 falchions which people really knew about existing. And I started to just look into it. And the more you found, the more interesting it was. And, I spent a couple of years on this, on and off, just sort of dabbling around with it. And there's problems because, what's a cusped falchion? What's a clip point? Is that a long clip point or a short clip point and all of this sort of stuff? And there was no language there. Nobody really understood what they were. What is a falchion? And what's the difference in a falchion and just a sword with one edge? And the more you're studying them, the more complex it became. And somewhere around sort of 2012 or so, I then sort of discovered that there are these things called messers, which nobody had really properly looked at. And then you had the early HEMA manuals, Bart Walzak, for instance, with his Codex Wallerstein translation, where you were reading the word messer in the actual Swabian text, and it was translated to falchion. And I'm sitting there sort of scratching where I had a lot more hair at the time, and it was just a mess. This contradictory and confusing landscape. And so again, Dunning-Kruger, confidence where you really shouldn't have any, made me look at it and say, maybe I should try to make some sort of lexicon which would identify what these objects are. And that sort of then started going to doing line drawings and sketches. And entirely by accident, I ended up sort of creating a typology. That got presented at the Robert Lyon Scott conference in Glasgow back in, would it have been 2014, I think? And there are quite a few people in that sort of audience. A certain Mr. Peter Johnson, for instance, who was incredibly enthusiastic and encouraging, I think is the best way of putting it. And I owe him so much for his willingness to encourage and say that it was worth it instead of me just dabbling around. And at that point, I sort of went, okay, this is worth doing. This is worth doing right. And yeah, that sort of spiraled from there. And he then asked me a year later, and it ended up in Dashfurt.
Yeah.
Which, just get that sorted. So that was pretty much set in stone at that point. Although I keep looking at it, wanting to think about how I could rewrite certain parts of it, and I'm not sure if people will allow me to change it without breaking my kneecaps. It's a little bit daunting now. There are an awful lot of sections which have been added to that on subjects like Nagels, which you get on Messers, which weren't really published at the time because I was still trying to work out how to do a clear language for it.
So that's really cool in the end, but you still didn't make your web page. So.
Yes, I've never done the web page because it just felt like it had to be done properly. It had to be published. It had to be peer reviewed. If it was just a web page, it would just be, if you pardon the language, dicking around. And I didn't want to do it that disservice. But I think it was definitely the Dunning-Kruger sort of style of not knowing enough that allowed me to get away with doing it. And I remember talking with John Clements, of all people. There's a throwback to the early days of HEMA where many people will be having a giggle, I expect. But he sort of recounted that he was talking to you at Oakshott one day, and he said that Oakshott had told him he decided to never try to classify single-edged arms because it was too complex. And if I'd known that before I tried to classify single-edged arms, I probably wouldn't have tried to. Not knowing that something is impossible is sometimes an advantage.
Yes, although, and this I think matches perfectly the moment comment by Eric from Winter Cutlery. Yeah, the research potential of contrarian instincts is unmatched. So definitely that, and not knowing what you're getting into.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's such a rabbit hole. And it's led to a lot of difficulties. There's a group of us, the historians, and we often sort of talk about how we need to reassess Oakshott because it's got limitations. And at the same time, I'm in a very privileged position, having had one typology published, which most people don't ever get. And I now sometimes say that typologies are a mistake. And I think that's a little bit of a controversial opinion. It becomes a straitjacket where people expect all objects to fit into a typology. And Oakshott's work in particular is a problem in that regards, in that he is a product of the Cold War. When he says records of a European sword, he doesn't mean Europe. What he means is Western Europe, which was accessible during the Cold War And anything which is on the far side of the Iron Curtain was almost unknown. And that's a very problematic classification system as a result. It misses a lot. And my work in the same way becomes a straitjacket. People are expecting objects to get shoehorned in and fit into it. And it's why I quite often sort of comment online when people say, what type of sword is this? And, you know, we do a picture of a fantasy sword or something like that. And I'll say, you don't need to crowbar every sword into a type or a name or a classification, because they didn't.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a work of reconstruction. It's a work of, like, it's a modern tool for the modern researcher or enthusiast. But there's okay. So actually, we have a question before we get into some of mine, by Julian Ronneberger again. So, what's your favorite extant messer? And if you had to name one, and why?
Now there's a challenge. It's sort of like saying which one's your favorite child, isn't it? There are some absolutely beautiful messers. The Hans Sommersperger group in particular are amazing. They're works of art. They are, you know, cast filigree. They have mother of pearl and probably ebony, or it might be mahogany paneling. They have blades with hundreds of fullers, tiny little hexagonal fullers. You know, you have to admire them. But I don't think they're the best because they're so ostentatious. I kind of I like the simplicity or the purity of line that you get on what I call Type 5 blades, which are just straight spear tipped. They're austere, they're simple, they were really, really understated, and I quite like that as a style. And there's a whole group of those which really I think they stand out as being very elegant as a result. They just, you know, they're not flashy at all, and I quite like that. I also like the fact that messers often were quite lower class. You know, you look at swords of princes and lords and all of that, and yeah, they're very decorated and beautiful and rich and gilded, and it's a little bit crass, perhaps, you know, gauche. You know, they're a bit too overdone. And I love the tastelessness of medieval art, you know, every color being splashed on everywhere. But at the same time, I think it's a little bit nicer sometimes to have minimalism.
I mean, we do live in the modern time with modern aesthetics too, so that we are the children of our time, I suppose. One question I have before we move into some of the others we're getting, if I can keep up with everything, is why do you think knowledge or understanding of single-edged swords kind of disappeared, like actual knowledge of the object versus, let's say, other types of sword? While, because if I think about it, from the mess from falchion to the hanger and the hunting weapon into the like military sidearm of the 19th century, we do have like an uninterrupted tradition of single-edged swords. So you would imagine it's kind of to flow in a kind of evolution, but seems not to be the case.
It's I think perhaps it's because there is a constant evolution. In many ways, the medieval sword dies out. You know, 15th century, 16th century. There is a transition point where the two-edged sword really sort of comes to the end of its lifespan. And it continues on for a little while in a few areas, like the Scottish two-hander, But as a result, because there is a termination there, and then you get a new form of two-edged sword, which is the small sword and the likes, that becomes a clear delineation. The falchion sort of tends to blend and change and become the early saber, and sabers become, and hangers then become cutlasses and the military saber. And as a result, I think that the earlier forms get forgotten. And I think it's an odd sort of situation that something which continues, you forget about what came before and you just consider the modern version of it.
Mm-hmm.
I often use cars as a good example because your grandfather would have driven a car and you will drive a car, but are they the same thing? No, they're totally different, but we
Mm-hmm.
call them the same thing. And so, in our mind, if someone says, I'm driving a car, you'll think of something modern. And that sort of development over time, I think, is one of the problems of both linguistics and archaeology, that we forget about what was in the past if we keep using it. The Byzantine archaeology is the same because they are notorious for using the same names for totally different weapons 500 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be a sort of cultural continuation. So you get words like paramerion and Romphahea, I think it is, being used for totally different objects. And the previous iterations of those sort of get forgotten as a result.
Mm. Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions to catch up on. Again, Eric is asking which of the types seen in art that you haven't yet seen in person would you like to discover?
Ooh. At this point, I suggest we pop up a
Yep,
screenshot of the typology because
there we
if
go.
anyone if
So,
anyone
by the
doesn't know
way,
what we're talking about, so
and this is made by the Latrex, so thank you,
yes,
Andy,
thank you there.
for the
Um, I also see he's asked what type of medieval sword is best and why is it the falchion. Um,
exactly.
I believe word is "oh behave." Yeah. So this is the bare bones of the typology which I put together, and the various types. There are 5 main groups, which are Group 1, Group 2, 3, 4, and 5. Um, the ones that I would really love to find would be a Type 1D, which is the broad sort of cleaver type blades extended into a long point.
Mhm.
Um, None of those survive. Um, a couple of years back, as I say, I've had quite a bit of interesting pushback from the study and the typology when it was made. Um, I had people telling me that it was all made up. Well, yes, it was, but not in the way that they meant. But they were criticizing that things like the Type 1Cs, which are depicted in the Machiowski Bible, were completely fictitious and that nobody had seen any of these and they were just made up completely. And a couple of years ago, Florian Messner in North Italy um, found one in one of the museums. And that was such a satisfying moment in that it vindicated that the types which I had extrapolated as being fundamental forms, even though they didn't exist in the archaeological record, were real. And it now exists in the archaeological record. Um, but the type 1D is the one which is elusive, shall we say. There's no surviving examples that I'm aware of. And I've probably got 30, 35 years life in me. So there's still time for one to be found. But if it isn't while I'm still alive, I really hope that one is eventually found, just so I can sort of go, told you, even if it is from the dead. And I think that would be the fascinating one. I suspect that those were reinforced tips where you get very pronounced distal taper and then it gets wider towards the tip. Quite similar to some of the early halberd types, in fact. And I want to look at one of those and see if my suspicion is right, because I looked at the Type 1Cs. I made some estimates of what they would be like, and I was proven right. And that was very satisfying to, I think I had enough of a grasp of the understanding. And I think that's part of the reason I continue making things, is to understand the physical properties of an object. It helps to sort of be able to have a 3D object in your hands to sort of understand what some of the more complex types are like and why they aren't, that mythical axe that people used to claim they were.
So when we talk about your typology versus, let's say, well, first of all, what is the, let's say, pool of extant examples known at least, or do you have a kind of clear understanding of what exists still?
Yeah, there are three main groups. Falchions, messers, and single-edged swords. Single-edged swords are the most difficult one, despite the fact that in some ways they're quite common. And that's simply because I tend to refer them as hiding in plain sight. And it's really easy. You go through 1960s or earlier books and you look at it and you look closer and you look closer still. And eventually you go, hang on a minute, that fuller is on the side. But you can't tell for sure. So there's a single-edged sword, but it's not listed as anything. It's just, you have to spot it there. And you go there in person, you travel to a museum, you look at it there, and you might well find there are more single-edged swords than you would expect, but they look exactly like any other sword, just in profile. Then you get the falchions, which are generally, but not always, more curved. And the difficult part of that is the fact that sometimes it's just the cutting edge which is curved. Sometimes the whole thing has a curvature. Those are challenging. I believe there are less than 40 which survive worldwide. There are probably more fakes than there are originals, especially when it comes to the earlier types. And they have a sort of evolutionary change which takes place probably around 1550, give or take a couple of years. And they start to become a lot more common at that point. So for my study, I've tried to have a cutoff point of around 1550 and not include those ones which are more modern than that, because they tend to be a very different design philosophy. And those ones do become heavier. They become much more suited as anti-armor, heavy cutting weapons. And it does distort the data of the earlier examples. Conversely, if you look at manuscript in art, they are incredibly common there. And that's one of the research areas which I've had to try and sort of reconcile, is what's going on. why are there hundreds of these falchions depicted in books of hours and speculum historiale and things like that? What's going on? What's the contrast? And so that's meant that you have to study the society and the history of the society. And then you get messers, which don't appear at first. They sort of crop up roughly around 1400, give or take 5 years either side of that date. And they become incredibly common throughout Central Europe. People often describe them as being German, but that's not really doing them a good justice. They're a very Central European style, but they also spread in quite remarkable degree. You find them in Iceland, you find them in Estonia, you find them in Ukraine, Bulgaria, and into Croatia and Serbia and the likes. So there's a wide geographic spread. And you get a few in the Netherlands and one or two small sort of knife-style ones in Denmark and the likes. Oddly, they don't end up in the British Isles. The British have a group which are normally called the Wakefield Hangers, which seem to have sort of been the equivalent. British people having to be different from Europe. Have we heard that before? So each of these different groups is slightly distinct, but they all have to sort of merge together. You can't study one in isolation. And you often get some blade types which are found on messers, but you also find some blades which are only found on falchions. And this typology has been designed to try to cover that entire spread to some degree. And it's one of the reasons it's sort of hilt agnostic. I tend to have a prefix of F for falchion or M for messer. So an M3 would be a messer of type 3, an F3 would be a falchion of type 3. And it's incredibly deep rabbit hole of a subject, and the more you study it, the more uncertainties you find, and that's part of the reason it's taken so long to even get close to even producing anything.
So when you mention, for example, type 1C and its appearance in reality after you studied it or kind of hypothesized its characteristics via artistic depictions, have you found a lot of unrealistic, like have you had to discard many things that you find in art as not probably not existent?
Generally speaking, I've tried to have a sort of minimum threshold of sort of 2 to 3 archaeological examples, or a dozen or so depictions in different sources. So a good example of that is the Romance of Alexander, the Bodleian Library, which is well known. It's got a two-handed type 2 blade with a knuckle bow on it. But it only really appears in that one manuscript. So if I was to find another couple of manuscripts which depict that, I might add that as a subtype. But because it's a single source, I feel that is unreliable as a primary source. But at the same time, you look at the depictions of objects and they are consistent enough that you can find them in multiple sources. And you have to acknowledge that some of them are somewhat fictitious, but at the same time, they are depicting real life objects. A good analogy to this, I think, is if you imagine somebody in 500 years' time having to use modern films to try to understand firearms, and they have a copy of Jurassic Park. So what's in that film? Well, it's not a dinosaur. You know, that is obviously fictitious. It's computer generated. But the character with a SPAS 12 shotgun, clever girl, that's a real weapon. So you need to be able to understand the context of the images to understand which parts are real and which parts are fiction. So that very much sort of expands on understanding where the art style is and what depictions of art mean. And I'm sure hopefully you'll get Peter Johnson on here someday. He'll get to talk about geometry. And I suspect that in some ways the manuscript art is depicting the unholy or the slightly profane in the depictions of falchions. A two-edged sword has a wholeness of its parts, as Peter would say, and it is a reflection of the Christian ideal, this geometry, the God as geometer who creates the universe using compass, for instance. And the single-edged sword, it's asymmetric in Italian. It's a storta. It's distorted. It's twisted, and that idea that it's not quite as perfect. I think that there is a language and a meaning in that. So the depictions in art are often showing figures who are the unchristian. You see it being carried by the Romans at the crucifixion or the opening of a tomb. Or the Philistines, Goliath is carrying a falchion. And again, the romance of Alexander the Great is carrying a falchion. He is a hero of a romance, but he's not a Christian hero. And so he is carrying it as a visual shorthand. And I think that's something which we need to understand, that context in how the art is depicted and what it's depicting. So if you've got secular art, it's not as common to see falchions. And that, I think, then reflects the archaeological reality that we only have 40 or so of these found. I like river finds because they are they're very indiscriminate. You know, a rich sword or a prince's sword is just as likely to fall off a horse crossing a river as a poor man's sword. And you know, a falchion has no reason to jump out of its scabbard compared to any other. And so if you look at how many falchions there are in river finds, and you compare that with two-edged swords, there's a huge disparity between that and the depictions in art. And I think that shows that the falchion was very rare. And that raises the question of why. And this sort of comes to the conclusions of the connotations and the meanings of it. But then you look at messers, and, you know, messers are 10 a penny. I have a river find messer.
Sorry, before we move to messers, your mention of Alexander with a falchion is the perfect moment to address this question.
Yeah.
So are there pieces of evidence suggesting that falchions are directly inspired by falcata from classical period? Or is it just a matter of same problem leading to same solution?
I tend to cause a little bit of trouble here. Again, I don't like the idea of evolution and inspiration in weapons. Bashford Dean loved it. He
Mhm.
created these evolutionary timelines of weapons and armor. And I mean, he was a marine biologist. And yes, fish can evolve, but weapons don't. They develop over time, but it's a different process. And I think something as simple as a one-edged weapon or a two-edged weapon can be reinvented multiple times in different societies. So I think from what we can see in the archaeology, you have single-edged weapons like sacks in particularly Norman sort of France and the British Isles in a special case. And somewhere around 1050 to possibly 1066, those really drop out of fashion. Um, and they just disappear from the archaeological record. There's no more of them in that sort of area of Europe. But what's quite interesting is if you travel up to Estonia, Lithuania, that sort of area, they were still in use all the way into the 13th century when you got the Livonian Crusades and the Teutonic Knights, and then they fall out of fashion.
Mm.
So I think that's telling me from looking at that there is a sort of a stigma or an opposition to the use of single-edged arms, which comes with the rise of Western European Christianity of the late 10th or the early 11th century. And that results in a decline.
Mm.
But that doesn't stop a single-edged weapon being functional. Religious dogma doesn't mean that a weapon stops cutting, for instance. And so, 150, maybe 200 years later, you head along a little bit and they end up reinventing it. But they reinvent it within the framework of their society rather than it being a continuation of items like the sax or the falcata.
Mm.
They might have been aware of the existence of saxes and falcata. There's no doubt that we have surviving examples. And, a great example of classical archaeology in the end of the medieval era is things like the Roman Syncrideia appearing and being influenced, or sorry, the Italian Syncrideia being influenced by Roman Pugio and the likes. And so I think that there's a precedent there for influence and inspiration, but at the same time, it's redesign and reinvention which is happening.
Mhm. Makes a lot of sense, I would say. Also, thank you for mentioning Peter Jonsson, because he actually will be, so a quick spoiler here, but he will soon be a guest here as well. So we'll continue the conversation on. One question I have looking at your typology is, apart from, let's say, like, I assume the main criterion you have here is blade overall kind of shape and curvature, with then the tips kind of. But do we also see a chronological or geographic? Like, can you kind of also design or build chronological or geographical waves within these typologies?
Oh yes.
And if so, what are the most interesting?
Oh, there are definite geographical developments. Um, I'm just spotting in the chat.
Yeah.
Christian is saying about the fact that he sent money and the acceleration of conscience, and yes, it is going to work. Yes, for Bjarne, who was asking, yeah, I'm slowly working on a book, but I joke that it will be before the heat death of the universe. I've actually been having a lot of problems with my health for the last little while, and that might well actually accelerate it because I just can't be making things as much as I used to be. So cheer me on, I'm falling apart. That might make it faster. Yes. Going back to the question there. There are definite geographical styles. Type 4, for instance, are very much influenced by Ottoman styles, which appear in the 15th century as, the Ottoman conquest was that 1450s onwards, and they rise in influence. So you find those in Hungarian areas, or you find blades on sword-like hilts in the early single-edged Schiavona. Type 2s are very much found in northwestern Europe, particularly the Netherlands, Belgium, what would have been Burgundian territory at the time. They might have spread a little bit into the British Isles. The Type 1Cs, we still don't know for sure, but I think that they were called Falcastro, and they are definitely North Italian in style. And you find them depicted in art and manuscript in North Italy, southern France. And the hint of what their name is comes from one of the examples, which is being used for the martyrdom of St. Peter of Verona, which still survives. It's in the seminary of Seveso, which is just near Milan, I think. And that is a distinctive type, a distinctive style. Type 3s are quite common across the entire sort of spread of most of Europe, but the short clip points are often found on messers in more Eastern Europe, or Czech Republic, Poland, bits of Hungary and the likes. So yeah, there are individual geographical areas. Post Solingen publication, I added 2 extra type 5s for short knife styles, which are associated with Bauernwehr. And one of those is very much a sort of almost like a broken back. You get an angle in them. And that's very much found in Slovenia, for example. You also find it in Austria and a little bit in Hungary and the likes, and a few in Switzerland. I suspect those were possibly being manufactured in Basel. And a lot of them have come with surviving sheaths, and the sheaths have metal frames, which are exactly the same as you find on Swiss baselards, which is a pretty good indication that they're coming from the same workshops. So yeah, each of these sort of different groups has been geographically distinct to some extent, and I think that we need to sort of form sort of families or groups of these which show associations of similarity, and you often get little bits of variation, a slightly different blade or a slightly different hilt, but they're of the same form. And families like that are something which I think are underrepresented in study, and it's something which needs to get done for Oakshott as well as the next step of study, to avoid the constraints of typological straitjackets.
So almost more of a more fluid approach in a sense.
Yes.
So yeah, and this kind of maybe is a good moment to talk about typologies in general. If you already kind of touched on the
Yeah.
point, as someone who did come up with a typology, you are probably actually the best to be able to
Yeah.
spot their weaknesses and also the effect they have perhaps on the community overall. Because I know that as
There's
I
yeah.
yeah,
Go
well,
on.
I'll let
Sorry.
you I'll
Yeah.
let you
There's
talk about it.
definitely an inclination of people to try to want, a type 15 or a type 18 or, whichever type, because they've looked at the basic introductions. And
Mhm.
you really do find that it's a very convenient introduction to a subject, but it also very much limits people's understanding of how broad the subject can be. Um, One of the ones which I really like as an example are Oakeshot's Family M.
Mhm.
And those are the sort of pieces, a bit like the Munich example in the Bayerisches National Museum. And it's, a wheel pommel, um, beautiful sort of Coke bottle shape grip. In its case, an S-shaped cross, so it's got beautiful sinuous curves and a Type 18 blade. But then you go to the Met Museum and you can look at one of the examples they have there, and it's almost a bowl pommel. The cross has got the same sinuous S, but it's got a bit of a down curve, and it's on a Type 17 blade. And,
Mhm.
you know, going by typology, these are totally different swords, but stylistically, artistically, chronologically, geographically, these are two of the same family. And I think that's the part where typologies restrict and sort of strangle, not innovation, but strangle definition. People want to fit things into groups. And I often joke that it's using a crowbar and a gallon of lube to do so. And it doesn't need to be that way. You can
Yeah.
easily have an object and say, this is somewhere between a 17 and an 18, or this is a very cut oriented 18, this is a very thrust oriented one. Each different group like that has a little bit more distinct personality, and I think that's something which we need to fight to understand the broader scope of medieval fashion and medieval styles.
And how do you think publications or, let's say, research work can adapt this need for flexibility and fluidity in the definitions with the kind of needs to fix things in a
I, I think
text
it's
or
difficult. Um, for publication, I think people are expected to really have it all nailed down and defined.
Mhm.
Whereas, if you do a publication which sort of goes, that one could be one or the other, people are just going to say, you don't know what you're talking about. So I think we need to sort of acknowledge the purpose of typologies, as well as encourage the use of things like families, which haven't really been addressed yet.
Mhm. Eric has a
Mm,
hypothesis here, so tempted to think it's not so much the fault of typologies, so much as how
yeah,
the current discussion is led by manufacturer, not scholastic discussion.
yeah. I think it's. I kind of wonder if there are other areas of semi-academic interest where typologies are as common as in sword use.
Mm.
Um, I've never heard of anybody really sort of getting worked up, shall we say, about what sort of type of Roman brick they're going to be using for a depiction of something. And I think that's partly because we are using manufacture as a common sort of popularity. People still want to buy swords, whereas most people really don't need to buy Roman bricks. And I think sword making may have sort of ended up relying on typologies as a result of that popularity a bit more than it would in a more academically esoteric subject.
Maybe also pairs with the difficulty of attributing it to someone, in the sense that I'm thinking like now of art. So it's way easier to say, oh, this is something from a like Venetian school versus Milanese school of drawing or painting. But with swords, you're kind of, with rare exceptions, maybe it's a little bit more like your areas are broader, your time frames may be more expanded. And okay, we have a couple of other comments coming in too. So just I'll quickly. So Julian Noronneberger mentions, feeling the pain on the Spadone project as well. I can imagine every little detail there also falls a victim to classification needs. Bjarn is suggesting a compromise on your publication. I think so. If you can't get it out on swift timing, raw data would also be pretty cool.
Well, I think my plan for publication at the moment is a book on the subject of the typology. Finally get that out with all of the naggles and everything, which I've sort of managed to group and classify and codify, and that hasn't really been properly published yet. And what that'll do is I'll probably include a couple of examples as case studies. The next point after that will be to start on the really big piece, which is some kind of an equivalent to records of the medieval sword for single-edged arms. And that's the one which gets difficult because there's a lot of publishing rights from museums. One of the problems with records is it is full of mistakes. It's a mess in many ways. And it really needs a revised edition. I know Fabrice Cognot has talked about this, Matt Easton has talked about this as well, that it would be great to do, a second edition in effect. But we're never going to get the publication rights. It would cost so much to get permission to use all of those objects in 101 different museums that nowadays it's financially impossible. I sort of wonder whether we should just sort of DIY it as a pirate publication and stick it on the internet anonymously or something like that. And I've just said that out
loud. Not anonymous anymore.
Yeah, and not anonymous, so we can't do it. But yeah, it's a big problem of actually the practicalities of getting something. If you don't have the access to the objects themselves, it becomes really impractical. And I would really like to have every single one in that published with high quality photos, measurements on a grid so that people can scale it up and blow it up to real size. And I've just spotted a comment there of typology raging in biology for decades, and yes, absolutely, yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, it's now where was I? Sorry, sidetracked. Told you I'd go off on tangents.
We were at the publication difficulty of access.
The publication I'd like to have on grids, scale, textual descriptions, illustration of detail, all of those sort of pieces, so that every single one has all the hard data as well as a little bit of a study of description of what the piece is. And I sort of anticipate I would probably have 20 to 25 falchions, probably maybe 50 messers, because they're more common, and maybe 20 single-edged swords as examples of that. And it's slowly working my way towards those. But I must admit, part of the difficulty of that is financial. I need to travel to Italy, to Milan to study pieces there. I need to travel to Reykjavik to study messers, which are up in their collection. And everywhere in between, you know, Hungary, back to the National Military Museum there, and south of France. And there are areas in the United States now where I'm not sure I really want to travel to go and study those objects just now. So it's a daunting project to do, and it's not ideal in the slightest, really.
And how have you found accessibility to museums? On your experience, have you found like an open environment, or?
It's 50-50. It's either come in, take a look, or it's, whoa, you can't look at that. I did a call to try and study the Thorpe Falchion, and I was sort of explaining what I was doing. I was halfway through explaining when the curator goes, come down, take a look at it, you can handle it. It's just like, oh, okay, that's welcoming. You know, some curators are amazing. They are absolutely fabulous for that. And at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you get things like the Conyers Falchion, which is, after 10 years of badgering them, they had got as far as being willing to let me look at it. But I wasn't allowed to touch it. So, you know, I couldn't turn it over. Oh no, they would have to do that. And they wouldn't let me take photographs, but I would be allowed to sit there and draw it by hand. Madness. However, being given the offer to look at it was more than the curators of the Royal Armouries had ever got to that point. So I must be doing something right there. So I'm still hanging on there, and I'm going to try and heckle a little further to try and see if I can get actual access to put my grubby mitts on it, because that will teach me a lot more.
So when it comes to handling of antique swords, you've been able to handle, in terms of, let's say, if you look back at your typology, excluding the ones that don't exist for knowledge, have you been able to actually handle every one of them?
Not every one. I've handled about half. Again, limitations of cost and accessibility. I suspect that I'll be able to handle a lot more eventually, but money. I have been limited in what I've been making in terms of income as a craftsman just because of bad health for the last few years, and it has slowed me down terribly. And as a result, I just haven't had the spare cash to. I have wondered about things like Patreons, and I don't really like that approach. It feels a bit wrong, and you know, I worry about that sort of thing. So I might have to bite the bullet someday and do so, but I need to work out how I can reward people who do support it if I do so. We'll see.
Yeah. And you already mentioned kind of that by handling, you've seen some differences in terms of like blade thickness. And have there been other big surprises that when you got to actually handle a real one, you said, well, I did not.
I can give you an example of that if you give us 2 seconds.
Yes.
One moment. This also gives me a chance to put my lights on.
Okay. So in the meantime, I'll remind everyone, if you haven't, if you would like to, please subscribe to the channel. That would be really cool. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, here we are, and a bit more light. So, if you give us half a moment,
Mm-hmm.
let me be responsible for once in my life.
For the important things.
And I'm going to increase the lighting here so everyone can scream in horror as I turn into a even more of a shambling zombie. So here we go. This is an example of a Langus Messer. Probably third quarter, maybe fourth quarter of the 15th century. Absolutely beautiful little hunting style. Probably had horn grips on it, or antler, in which case it might have been called a Jagdmesser, hunting messer. So we always go on about these weapons having amazing distal taper and all of that, and how these are light and thin. And it is light. It's only about 800 grams. But here we go. And it is, if you give us a moment, 6.3 millimeters up at the cross. So nice, stiff blade.
Yeah.
And then you get down to here, and it's still, one moment, 5.7.
That is considerably thick.
This is an incredibly stiff blade. It tapers in the last 6 inches, 15 centimeters, down to about 3 millimeters. But still here, it's incredibly stiff. And this, I suspect, was for hunting, for that final thrust for the kill. I'm not sure if it was ever a very good cutter, and it has quite a broad edge on it. I'm comfortable to do this without worrying that I'm going to slice my fingers, whereas other examples I have are considerably more risky, shall we say. So let's see if we can get this. Is this focusing okay?
It looks good to me, but I think we'll be hearing protests if it doesn't.
As an example of just how delicate these nagels are, people are overbuilding these. They're making them way too big and chunky often. But if it's for reenactment use, you don't want that bending in 10 seconds flat. So you can understand why. But this is just a perfect example of just how delicate a piece can be. Very, very small grip, and yet an incredibly chunky blade, but it's light. If this was used in fighting, I'm not sure it was, but it would still be quite mobile. It would be quite an agile piece, but I don't think it would be a great cutter. So this is a case where you look at archaeology and it just changes your perceptions of what pieces are. And, at one end, incredibly delicate, little, fine, and at the other end, great, big and chunky in the same object. And so I think that's something which we really need to look at and illustrate more in examples.
I wonder, how does that feel to you in terms of balance? Because of course, horn grips wouldn't add much weight, so you would have a rather...
It's very far forward.
Okay.
Let me get it. There we go. And that's nearly 20 centimeters. So it's a very, very odd piece. Is it typical? I'm not sure, but I think it's illustrative of a very different style of weapon, quite possibly civilian, civil structure, civil society. And the messer is definitely a part of a social construct. People are asking why it becomes common in Central Europe? And I think the answer is fashion. It becomes a fashionable weapon to carry. And something like this would have been carried as almost like an affectation. It's like the small sword of the 17th century in this regards. It's social status, it's masculine jewelry. And it might well be used for that final kill against, I don't know, boar or deer or something like that, as a show of macho strength, which is a bit of a societal example which people don't really expect. But this can then be contrasted with the military fighting examples, and those, again, are completely different. Shall I pull out another example in that case?
Yes, please.
War archaeology.
Yeah, as many as you can, I would say. I think I speak for most of the people watching. And in the meantime, thank you, Julian or Julian. Happy you did tune in.
Yes. So here we go. For something, I have to zoom out to get this. A significantly bigger piece, broken at the end, would have originally probably been about that much longer. Might have been a little clipped point, might have been more of a rounded tip. But this is very much a fighting weapon in comparison. Wooden grips, still some wood still surviving on it. Thickness, massively thick in the tang. And then you see the size of this nagel in comparison to that other one. As a note, for people who might have an interest in the subject, I don't think these were called nagels in period. I've been looking at a couple of documents, and I've found the term, I think it's tirna, meaning thorn. And if you look at that, it's just like a rosebush thorn or something like that. So I think there is a differentiation in fighting weapons. You get the very broad ones, which often have sort of ridges in them, which might have been called tsunga or tongue, because obviously it looks like a tongue. So there are different types, which I think made differentiation. And this is a beautiful piece, river found. I don't know if you can see if I put there, but there are narrowings in this. This has been sharpened or resharpened. So this was probably used actively at some point. It's double fullered, but very, very subtle fullering, if you can see that in the light. And it's a much larger weapon, comparisons almost enough for a hand and a half use. And yet,
sorry, I'll mute myself. There's a motorbike starting just outside, so I don't want to bother.
It's not that you're hungry and stomach rumbling. So yeah, balance point much closer to the hilt, but still far enough out that this would have been a powerful cutter. And if I find my calipers again, just to jewel at it, it goes from 8.1 down to 2.7. Oh, actually, not even 2.7. It is 2.1 there. So 8 mil to 2 mil compared to the other one, which goes down by just half a millimeter or so.
That is quite impressive.
And I expect that probably went even thinner. So that would have been a fabulous cutter. And unfortunately missing a little piece, but you can't have everything, can you?
We had an interesting comment again here by Damocles. I think he's referring to your first one where you showed the balance point, mentioning it's quite similar to many of his African fighting swords, like Cascadas, Fleece, so that tip heaviness. Do you think, or do you know African, like North African or African combat
I've
systems?
seen
Do
a
you think
few
would?
of them.
Mm,
We had a really interesting example of a cascara appearing on the site of the Battle of Flodden in Scotland a few years ago. Caused no end of confusion until finally somebody went, you know what that is? Um,
mm,
so, yes, I think forward-weighted blades are something which are not really not understood, but not really appreciated.
mm,
Um, we have a lot of examples of very, very pronounced cutters, but people want stuff which is a bit more agile. You know,
yeah,
if you're just sort of doing backyard cutting of cardboard boxes or something, there's no point. It's overkill. So they want
yeah,
something which feels nice in the hand, and you know your average long sword with a 12 centimeter point of balance feels good,
mm.
whereas these they're they're a bit more brutal, shall we say, and I think that's not really everyone's cup of tea. And
Do you
so
think that is influenced by practice, like both by Olympic fencing, maybe at the top of
yeah,
it, but then into HEMA and the need to, let's say, perform in a
yeah,
sport-like
I
environment? Okay.
I think it's definitely influenced by what people are using for HEMA and things like that. And I quite enjoy sort of challenging people's perceptions when I make things. If I go the complete opposite direction,
Yes.
carefully, because it's sharp, a piece of my own work. This is a Hungarian messer, and that is quite pronounced with a far forward balance point for its length. It's
Mhm.
about 16 centimeters roughly. Fantastic cutter, as you can imagine, with the blade of that sort of shape. And so, again, that's challenging people's preconceptions of what objects are like. Just put this out of the way before somebody has an accident. Um, so, yeah, there's very much a case of challenging conceptions, different styles, different shapes, and different purposes. You know, a hunting messer might be something very different to a civilian one.
And before we jump into a new question here from Adam, I'll get to you in just a
Yeah,
moment. I have a question about if we look at your typology, let's say, as you mentioned, they're kind of hilt agnostic, but what would have been the reason for someone, and I think it actually connects to Adam's question, so I'll put it
yeah.
here. What would have been the reason for someone to choose a falchion versus a master? Would it have been a style thing, or is it more like sometimes we talk about like sumptuary, not really sumptuary laws, but like, you know,
Mhm.
arm laws in urban context and stuff?
I think, okay, I think I can answer the question as part of the start of this, in
Hmm.
that falchions tend to appear approximately 1225, give or take 10 years. There's a pretty narrow window from when they appear.
Mm.
Whereas messers first appeared as small, sort of knife-sized pieces, Bauernwehr, around 1400. So
Mm.
there's 170 years sort of gap before you actually reach the messer becoming commonplace, where it is just sword-hilted, single-edged weapons. Um, the I think the choice is regional. Falchions are very much a Western European fashion. You find them in France, Burgundy, that sort of area, England.
Mm.
Messers are much more Central European. They appear in Austria, Czech Republic, Poland,
Mm.
the eastern or the east side of Germany. They're not as common in the far west of Germany and the Netherlands in comparison, but they do appear.
Mm-hmm.
They don't appear in England. That's almost universal. You can really count the number of Baronver which have been found in British Isles on one hand. So they're quite uncommon here. And they develop or they expand in use over time. So you start with a Baronver in probably about 1400, give or take 5 years either side. And I think that they're looked down on. They're considered to be quite lower class. In Hungarian, for instance, they're just called peasant knives, and I'm not going to try and pronounce that because I'd insult every single Hungarian I know if I try and mangle the language. But you know, they're definitely lower class. And then by about 1450, you're seeing them being depicted in knightly situations. You've got them getting longer, so they're becoming close to the sort of length of that smaller one there, and being carried on the side of knights. By 1480, 1490, they're being given as gifts to princes in other countries. So there is a social ladder that it's slowly climbing, where the perception of the weapon is being considered more socially acceptable. So if you're a civilian, you might well have been carrying a very early Langus Messer in 1440 as a fully formed weapon. And before that, you'd have been carrying a large Baronver, which gets bigger. And so eventually, you know, it's a Venn diagram where the edges are very blurry. So when is a long knife becoming a short sword? And you know, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, as they say. So that's very much a case that time has a progression there. And if you were a higher class civilian, you know, a burgher, for instance, rather than a peasant or a villein, you might have picked up a Messer a little bit later. And if you were an alderman of the city, it might have been later still. And if you were a prince, then of course it's much later still. And this sort of social strata over time as it becomes more acceptable and more fashionable. And when a prince finally does carry it, then everybody's copying them. And that driving factor of fashion is something which people don't properly appreciate, but I think is really, really important to understanding how arms and armor both develop over time. One of the wonderful examples of that are sabatons, which are always nice and pointy in your toes, until you end up with one of the Holy Roman Empires who had bunions and couldn't wear shoes like that. And so we had to have wide, broad shoes. And within half a generation, armor has followed and copied this fashion, because nobody wants to be the guy who's insulting the emperor by wearing the type of shoes he can't wear. And the same is probably happening with Messers. At some point, somebody decided to make a statement by wearing a Messer. It's like, oh, you can wear that. I can too. And so that sort of, you know, social aspect of it is something which I think changes over time.
Mm.
I hope
Do you
that answers
have,
your question.
yeah, Adam, feel free to interrogate further if you if you feel the need to. In the meantime, I'll ask, when is the first depiction that you're aware of where we see it being used by, let's say, a high-ranking person in an image?
I think there's a couple in the late 1440s, just in manuscript images of kneeling knights, for instance. So that's generally sort of the best parts. But you don't really get any depictions of Bamber as such until probably about 1420 or so. I think the earliest is in one of the Codex Palatine in the Vatican Library. There's a depiction of there. So it's very much a case of those early eras. It's not being depicted just because people aren't real. The people who are in society creating depictions aren't looking at those people. You know, it's they're lower class. It doesn't matter. Julian has just mentioned the regulation, and so I'm not sure if those are actual Messer in the idea of what we're thinking of Messer, or are they more Basilard like, which the Messer then comes from? I think there's this sort of blurring of where where the first Bernver appear is quite a challenge, and I would love if somebody just happened to have put a date on one of them. It would answer all the questions. But I think sort of last decade of the 14th century, first decade of the 15th is sort of when they really sort of have this tipping point and they become their own type and a style.
And okay, so a lot of unclarity on the start, perhaps, but you do draw a line in your typology at 1550s, right?
I think after that, Messers definitely sort of reach a terminal decline and they drop out of fashion, sort of not long after that. And the medieval falchion sort of falls out of fashion and starts becoming replaced with something which is quite different. You look at the examples from Brescia, for instance, with the multiple tiny little fullers and things, and they're a very different profile. They're an expression of Baroque art rather than an expression of medieval art. So I feel that's the point which you need to cut off at.
And you think let's say the fall off is one of style and fashion versus one of functionality, or do you connect this to, okay.
Yeah, I think there's a change of thought in society. You see it with the transition from the medieval sword to the rapier. There's a change in thinking going on there, and I think that is reflected in what's fashionable as a weapon. And I mean, it's not instant. It doesn't happen overnight, but there's a gradual move. I think sort of things like the Protestant Reformation possibly had some influence in it by challenging people's preconceptions of society. And, the ideas of Baroque art being something different to Renaissance art, and Renaissance being a carryover of medieval thoughts. I think that sort of thing really sort of reflects how society is changing.
And would it be a crazy assumption in listening to you to assume that
yes,
that you see the change in style as coming before a change in functionality? Like, I would assume most people, when they look at weapon change, would think, oh, this and this technology changed or warfare changed, and this is why we have new weapons. But it seems to me that you haven't mentioned once, let's say, the way of using it, or the but you have mentioned a lot, like style and fashion and all these very abstract reasons. So would that be a correct
I think
assumption?
so. It's I don't think that they changed the fighting style because of a change of a weapon. You change the weapon to what people expect or what people find aesthetic, and then you adapt the fighting to it. A good example of that is things like modern digital camouflage becoming widespread across multiple militaries. There's not really that much difference between digicam and, say, OPM camouflage from the 1970s in terms of practical functionality, but it's become the fashion, it's become the expected ideal. And I think the same happens with medieval weapons, that there is a gradual change because people are reconsidering what they expect a weapon to be. So, a dagger might become broader because it's echoing the styles of Rome. So now they work out how you can fight with it in a different way. And there are different areas in that, and I think also areas like different social levels and cost and expense. If something is very cheap and simple, you're not generally going to be using it for fighting, which is very complex, because the people who have got the riches to do that will go for something which is slightly more elaborate, and that might function in different ways. And I think things like the smaller Baron there are a good example of that. Some of those are remarkably simple. I'll pull another example out if you like, and I can illustrate that.
And
I figure
also
the more archaeology, the better.
Yes, absolutely. And in the meantime, I'll also, if anyone has further questions we haven't addressed or you would like to have answered, this is a good moment. We already hit the 2-hour mark, so I don't want to keep James too long.
I'm sorry, I
camera.
talk way too long.
I'm happy with that.
It's better than being monosyllabic for an interview, but I feel sorry for anybody who's listening to me on headphones. So here we go. This is an example of a, let me just get something to help see this. This is an example of a Baronwehr, Austrian, found in Elmslie. And you can, if I get there, you can probably see multifaceted blade profile. So that 3 edges, a short false edge which runs to about here, main body, and a bevel. Completely flat on the other side. So this was probably made very, very simply, forging on only one side, because you're not turning it over, you're not needing quite as much work. So it was done quick and fast and dirty. Small nagel to protect the hand, but very, very stiff. It's nearly 9 millimeters. It's not got a lot of taper. Even down here, close to the piece, it's still 4.9 millimeters. So just to confirm, 9 millimeters, 8.5. So, a very, very solid, quite weighty piece, almost as much mass as one of the small messers, for instance, but really, really simple to make. That's not the sort of thing which somebody who is, studying a martial art in a high society context is using. So I think that reflects how people would have adapted weapons to fashion quite well.
Yeah, and, makes a lot of sense.
It's if it makes sense for study of HEMA I think one of the questions people should ask is who would be studying this, not just when and where. And if you look at the fighting manuals, where it's, I mean, something like Gladiatoria, with its beautiful armor and the likes, is obviously much more higher class than a reference in Talhofer of fighting with your wife in a pit with her veil. These are very different social strata, and I think that sort of thing is something which needs to be looked at over time.
So as if HEMA wasn't already complicated enough, we now have the variable of also choosing your social
Yes.
level in competitions and tournaments. Okay, I think maybe on that note, I'll thank you for your availability. I think this was a really, really interesting and eye-opening talk for me to learn about your typology. Hopefully for everyone else, but also a really fun chat with you as a person
I assume
beyond
from
the
the lack of
author.
questions, everyone's fallen asleep.
Yeah, it seems so. I hope not, but well, we've had a lot of questions during the 2 hours so far anyway, so I consider that a success. So yeah, thank you.
Yep, it's
a
been a
lot.
pleasure.
You're
Hopefully it'll be
always
of use.
welcome. Yeah, I mean, we've opened a lot of tangents or followed a lot of tangents, but I think there are a lot more. So, so oh yeah, still here, nerds.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, if people do have other questions about the typology work and the likes, I'm happy to have a chat with anybody. You should be able to find me either on Reddit Swords, the Swords Discord group, which is commonly used, or the likes. And yeah, at some point this book will get progress, and heckling will always be an advantage to get me closer to getting it done. As I say, I might well consider a Patreon at some point. If people have opinions on that, I'd greatly appreciate hearing it so that I can start having a think about whether that's a direction I should take.
I'll give my opinion on it, and I think if it's opening the door to more research, absolutely yes, is my vote.
Yeah.
Oh, here we have some heckling.
There we go.
In the nick of time.
You see, this is the thing. I am absolutely terrified. I have imposter syndrome up to here, so it's definitely something which I'm afraid of making myself clear to be an absolute idiot, as opposed to people just suspecting I am. So hopefully someday we'll get over that and see what can be done.
Yeah.
Christian's asking whether it will be available as an audio book, but no, but I may do it as interpretive dance.
Well, that would warrant a Patreon, I think.
Danger. Yeah, we'll see what we can do.
Cool.
I must admit, I am inclined to go for print rather than digital versions, just because it would be. I dislike ebook versions. I like dead tree format. It needs to be weighty and sit on the desk, but also because I expect the first run will be limited edition, because I like limited edition books, and we'll see.
I also feel like this is a kind of community that does appreciate the physical medium.
Yes.
I mean, it's nice to be able to see things on a screen, but people's sword book collections are often bigger than their sword collections. So.
Oh gosh, yeah. My library is screaming under the weight of books, and works like Toby Capwell's English Armour. It's absolutely glorious to have a proper weighty volume. I think that it's also the difficulty of digitization. I want to have scale illustrations and the likes in it, so that anybody who wants to create can use it as a primary reference source. And if it's not done properly printed at the right scale, it just throws off all the data and it's not worth it for trouble. So stick it on a screen and suddenly, are you looking at it on a phone or a full-size screen, totally changes the interpretation of it. And yeah, I think that's probably a better approach for it. But there might be a sort of digital abridged version or something like that, which I'll put out for free because people need to be able to get some sort of access to it. Because that's accessibility. We have to acknowledge that for these days.
But and I will book a printed copy for sure before it runs out.
Eric's mentioning full-size fold-out, and I would love to. I would love to be able to just pull out a full-size, life-size image of, the Conyers falchion, for instance, which nobody's going to get their hands on. Would be amazing to do that sort of thing. The difficulty is that, because I have looked into this, doing that sort of thing, the cost of printing just sort of goes through the roof very, very quickly. And I'm not sure how we could really do that. I'd like a pop-up version for the Nagels just to confuse people.
That would be pretty fun.
but no, something like that. I expect there would probably be at least one sort of fold out, but it definitely needs to be a full-size coffee table book just to sort of give the data some sort of decent representation. And all of this is what makes it a bit more difficult, but also just the cost of travel to get to these places. There are some beautiful examples I'd really like to, but it's going to cost, thousands upon thousands in travel and accommodations and things like that, which has limited it for so long. And we'll see what we do.
If in Northern Italy, you're welcome to stay here. So
I have a list of Italy ones.
Cool.
I've got pieces in, is it Museum Prigazzoni, I think it is. There's a whole group in there. There's the ones in Severso, ones in Milan. So yes, I have to do a tour of that entire area and then head up north to get in contact with Florian Messner, because his PhD is a tour. Yes,
Florian, by the way, will also be talking soon here.
Wonderful.
We're kind of covering an interesting set of guests.
I would thoroughly recommend his work. It has been fantastic, and yes, he deserves a lot more recognition than he has already got. So whoever is watching this, when that one gets announced, put it in your diaries. I think that will be worthwhile.
Speaking of him and Giovanni Sartori, Florian Messner and Giovanni Sartori will be in Udine, if you're in Northern Italy, Austria, Slovenia, on I think June 8th for a conference on some research they've been doing. So you're more than welcome to join. I assume the more the merrier. Okay, thank you again so much, James. It's been really, really super cool, and have a nice rest of what's left of the weekend.
Time to get my voice back. Thank you very much. I hope it's been interesting for everybody, and we'll see what we can do. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you. Bye.
Now, how do I turn this off?